The rain lashed against the windows of Thornfield Manor with such violence that evening, as if nature herself sought to penetrate the fortress of wealth and privilege that stood defiant upon the hill. Within those walls, amid the glittering chandeliers and marble floors that spoke of fortunes both old and new, Alexander Thornfield stood before the full-length mirror in his dressing room, adjusting his cufflinks with the practiced indifference of a man who had long since ceased to find pleasure in luxury. He was 32 years of age, possessed of a fortune so vast that 3 generations might spend it freely without approaching its end, and he was, by all accounts, thoroughly bored with existence. His reflection showed a man of considerable height and lean build, with dark hair that fell carelessly across his brow despite the ministrations of the most expensive barbers in the city, and eyes of such penetrating grey that those who met his gaze often found themselves compelled to look away. There was about his mouth a certain hardness, a cynical turn that suggested he had sampled all that life offered and found it wanting. He was handsome, certainly, in that angular, aristocratic manner that graced the covers of business magazines and society pages, but it was a beauty touched by something cold, something remote, as if he observed the world from behind glass. The door opened without ceremony, and Marcus Whitmore entered with the easy familiarity of a friendship forged in the fires of boarding school and maintained through years of shared excess. Marcus was everything Alexander was not, warm where Alexander was cold, gregarious where Alexander was reserved, optimistic where Alexander saw only the mercenary nature of human relationships. He carried 2 glasses of whiskey, both expensive, both wasted on men who could no longer taste the difference between 50-year-old Scotch and something pulled from a suburban liquor store shelf. "Still going through with this madness, I see," Marcus said, extending 1 glass toward his friend. "I had rather hoped you would come to your senses." Alexander accepted the glass, but did not drink. "A dare is a dare, Marcus. You ought to know by now that I honor my commitments, however absurd they might be. But to marry her, to actually marry the girl, surely even you must see the lunacy in it. She is a housemaid, Alexander, a housemaid. Your mother will be apoplectic. The board will question your judgment. And society—" Marcus trailed off, making a gesture that encompassed the magnitude of social catastrophe that would surely follow. "Society," Alexander repeated, his voice flat with disdain, "can go to hell. As can the board, for that matter. As for my mother, she lost the right to dictate my choices when she decided her own comfort mattered more than her only son's welfare." There was history in those words, old wounds that had never properly healed, and Marcus, who knew that history well, had the grace to fall silent. The dare had been made 3 weeks prior, at a gentleman's club where bored millionaires gathered to drink themselves into oblivion and make wagers that revealed the essential emptiness of their lives. Someone, Marcus could not even recall who, had suggested that Alexander Thornfield, for all his wealth and sophistication, would never have the courage to marry beneath his station. The comment had been made mockingly, born of too much cognac and too little wisdom, but it had struck some nerve in Alexander that even he did not fully understand. "I will marry the plainest woman in my household," Alexander had declared, his voice cutting through the cigar smoke and laughter, "and I will do it within the month. $5 million says I go through with it." The bet had been accepted. Money had been pledged. And Alexander, true to his nature, had proceeded with the systematic efficiency he brought to all his business dealings. He had reviewed his household staff, a considerable undertaking, given that Thornfield Manor employed 37 people to maintain its grounds and serve its master's needs, and had selected his bride with the same cold assessment he might use to choose a stock portfolio. Miss Eleanor Gray was 24 years old, recently employed as a housemaid after responding to an advertisement placed by Mrs. Hendricks, the head housekeeper. She was, by all objective measures, unremarkable. Her figure was neither voluptuous nor fashionably slender, but rather that practical build that spoke of adequate nutrition and physical labor. Her hair was a color that could only be described as brown, without the luster of chestnut or the warmth of auburn, simply brown, pulled back in a severe bun that did nothing to soften the angles of her face. That face itself possessed none of the delicate features prized by society. Her nose was too strong, her jaw too square, her mouth too wide. Her eyes were her only remarkable feature, large and of a grey-green color that shifted with the light. But even these were often hidden behind a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles that gave her an owlish appearance. She was, in short, perfect for Alexander's purposes. Plain enough to satisfy the terms of the dare, educated enough to string together coherent sentences at the inevitable social functions he would be forced to attend, and, most importantly, so obviously out of her depth that she would surely be grateful for his attention and unlikely to make excessive demands on his time or emotions. He had proposed to her 4 days ago in the library while she had been dusting the shelves. The memory of that encounter brought a slight smile to Alexander's lips, though there was no warmth in it. She had nearly dropped the feather duster when he spoke, and had stared at him with those wide eyes, as if he had suggested they rob a bank together, rather than enter into the sacred bonds of matrimony. "Sir?" she had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "It is quite simple, Miss Grey," he had replied, his tone the same he might use to explain a business proposition to a slightly slow colleague. "I wish to marry, and I have selected you as my bride. The ceremony will take place this Saturday. You will, of course, sign a prenuptial agreement, the terms of which my lawyers will explain to you. In exchange for bearing my name and appearing at such social functions as I deem necessary, you will receive a generous monthly allowance, and should the marriage end in divorce, a settlement of $10 million. I trust this arrangement will prove satisfactory." The color had drained from her face, then flooded back in a most unbecoming manner. She had opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and finally stammered, "But sir, Mr. Thornfield, I cannot, that is to say, why would I wish to marry you?" He had finished for her, not unkindly. "Let us dispense with false modesty, Miss Grey. You are aware, I am sure, that you are not the sort of woman men of my station typically pursue. But I am not a typical man, and I have my reasons for this proposal. You need not concern yourself with them. The question is simply this: do you accept?" She had been silent for a long moment, her hands clutching the feather duster so tightly that her knuckles went white. He had watched the play of emotions across her face: shock, confusion, suspicion, and finally something harder to define, calculation perhaps, or simply the cold assessment of a woman who understood that opportunities like this did not present themselves twice. "I accept," she had said at last, her voice steadier than he had expected. "But I have one condition." He had raised an eyebrow at that, intrigued despite himself. "You are in no position to make demands, Miss Grey." "Nevertheless, I make one." She had lifted her chin, and for the first time he had seen something in her expression beyond nervous subservience. "I will marry you, Mr. Thornfield, and I will fulfill whatever duties you require of me. But I will not be treated as a curiosity or a joke. In public, you will accord me the respect due to your wife, whatever your private feelings may be. If you cannot agree to that, then you must find another woman to suit your purposes." He had been surprised, and surprise was not an emotion Alexander Thornfield experienced often. He had expected gratitude, perhaps tears of joy, certainly not this quiet dignity from a housemaid who should have been overwhelmed by her good fortune. It had irritated him and impressed him in equal measure. "Agreed," he had said curtly, and that had been the end of their courtship. Now, standing in his dressing room with Marcus watching him with undisguised concern, Alexander drained his whiskey in one swallow and set the glass down with a sharp click against the marble side table. "It is time," he said simply. The ceremony was to take place in the Manor's chapel, a small stone building that dated back 200 years and had witnessed the marriages of countless Thornfields, though none quite so irregular as this. Alexander had insisted on keeping the affair small, if the word could be applied to a wedding that still required 50 guests, a string quartet, and enough flowers to bankrupt a florist. The guest list consisted primarily of those who had been present for the original Dare, along with a few society columnists whom Alexander had specifically invited, determined that if he was to make a spectacle of himself, he would at least control the narrative. His mother had refused to attend, which Alexander counted as a blessing. His sister, Victoria, had sent a tersely worded telegram expressing her disappointment in his choices and her hope that he would come to his senses before irreparable damage is done. His father, dead these 10 years, could offer no opinion from the grave, though Alexander suspected the old man would have been more amused than appalled. James Thornfield had possessed his own streak of rebelliousness, his own disdain for society's conventions, though he had ultimately submitted to them in ways his son never would. The walk from his rooms to the chapel took Alexander through corridors lined with portraits of ancestors who stared down with varying degrees of approval and censure. He had never much cared for these paintings, these stern-faced men and women who had accumulated the wealth he now enjoyed. They had been ruthless in business, conventional in their personal lives, and ultimately as mortal and forgotten as any pauper. What did their opinions matter now? Marcus walked beside him, still attempting to dissuade him from this course. "It is not too late, Alexander. We can call it off. I will pay the 5 million myself if it means saving you from this folly. And deprive me of my bride? How ungallant of you, Marcus." Alexander's tone was light, mocking, but there was steel beneath it. "I gave my word. The matter is settled." The chapel was lit with candles that cast long shadows across the stone walls and made the stained glass windows glow with jeweled light. The guests were already assembled, their faces showing various degrees of curiosity, amusement, and in some cases, genuine shock. Alexander took his place at the altar, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression one of perfect indifference, as if he were attending a board meeting rather than his own wedding. The music began, some classical piece he did not recognize and did not care to identify. The guests rose, and Eleanor Gray appeared at the entrance to the chapel. Alexander had expected her to look absurd in bridal attire, like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. He had anticipated that the white gown would emphasize her plainness, that the veil would make her appear washed out and colorless. He had been prepared for the whispers and barely suppressed laughter of the guests. He had not been prepared for the woman who now walked slowly down the aisle toward him. Someone, Mrs. Hendricks, he assumed, or perhaps one of the other maids, had performed something approaching a miracle. Eleanor's hair had been released from its severe bun and now fell in soft waves around her shoulders, revealing that it was not merely brown, but possessed hints of auburn and gold that caught the candlelight. The spectacles were gone, revealing eyes that were larger and more striking than he had realized, framed by dark lashes. The wedding gown, while simple, had been tailored to fit her properly, and he found himself noticing for the first time that her figure, while not fashionable, was nonetheless pleasing in its proportions. But it was not these superficial improvements that arrested his attention. It was something in her bearing, in the way she held herself as she walked toward him. There was no false modesty in her expression, no simpering gratitude. She looked at him directly, her gaze steady and unreadable, and he realized with a shock that bordered on discomfort that she was not intimidated by him, by this ceremony, or by the assembled crowd of wealthy, powerful people who had come to witness her humiliation. She reached the altar and stood beside him. The minister, clearly uncomfortable with the entire proceeding, began the ceremony with undue haste, his voice stumbling over words he had spoken countless times before. Alexander made his responses mechanically, his mind elsewhere, trying to understand what he was feeling. Was it merely surprise? Surely nothing more than that. And yet, Do you, Alexander James Thornfield, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do, he said, his voice clear and firm. And do you, Eleanor Marie Gray, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? There was the briefest pause, so brief that perhaps only Alexander noticed it. Then, I do. The ring, an ostentatious diamond that Alexander had selected with deliberate bad taste, wanting to emphasize the absurdity of the entire affair, was placed on her finger. It looked ridiculous there, huge and glittering on her work-worn hand, and yet she did not flinch from its weight. I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. Alexander turned to Eleanor, prepared to deliver the perfunctory kiss that tradition demanded. But as he looked at her, at those steady grey-green eyes that met his without fear or adoration, he found himself hesitating. There was something in her expression, some quality he could not name, that made him feel suddenly that he had made a grave miscalculation. He kissed her anyway, briefly and without passion, his lips barely brushing hers. Yet even in that momentary contact, he felt something unexpected. A warmth, a softness, a sense of vitality that seemed to flow from her to him. It startled him, and he drew back more quickly than he had intended. The guests applauded, some genuinely, others with the polite restraint of people who are witnessing something they do not quite approve. Alexander offered Eleanor his arm, and together they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife into the uncertain future that stretched before them both. The reception was held in the grand ballroom, a space so vast and ornate that it seemed designed specifically to make ordinary mortals feel insignificant. Crystal chandeliers hung from the coffered ceiling like frozen waterfalls, casting prismatic light across marble floors that had been polished to a mirror shine. Long tables groaned under the weight of delicacies prepared by chefs flown in from Paris, New York, and Tokyo, and champagne flowed with the abundance of a man who could afford to be wasteful. It was, by any objective measure, a magnificent celebration. It was also utterly joyless. Eleanor stood beside her new husband, accepting congratulations from guests whose names she could not hope to remember, and whose faces blurred together in a parade of expensive cosmetic surgery and practiced insincerity. They assessed her with barely concealed curiosity, their eyes traveling over her gown, her face, her posture, searching for some explanation for Alexander Thornfield's inexplicable choice. She could hear the whispers that followed in her wake, the speculation and gossip that would fuel society columns for weeks to come. And yet she maintained her composure, her expression pleasant but not eager, polite but not servile. Alexander had abandoned her almost immediately upon entering the ballroom, swept away by a group of business associates who wanted to discuss some merger or acquisition that could not possibly wait until after his wedding celebration. Eleanor did not mind his absence. In truth, she preferred it. Standing beside him during the ceremony, feeling the eyes of all those wealthy, powerful people upon her, she had felt like an insect pinned to a board for examination. At least alone she could breathe, could collect her thoughts, could try to understand what she had done. Mrs. Thornfield, what a pleasure to finally meet you. The voice belonged to a woman who had materialized at Eleanor's elbow with the sudden appearance of a ghost. She was perhaps 40, beautiful in that ageless way that came from excellent genetics and unlimited access to the best dermatologists money could buy. Her gown was worth more than Eleanor had earned in her entire life, and her smile had the sharp quality of broken glass. I'm Victoria Ashford, Alexander's sister. Eleanor had known, of course, that Alexander had a sister, but she had not expected to meet her here, not after Mrs. Hendricks had mentioned that Victoria had declined to attend. She extended her hand. Miss Ashford, I'm pleased to meet you. Mrs. Ashford, actually. I've been married for 15 years to Charles Ashford, though I suppose you wouldn't know that. Victoria's handshake was brief and cold. I changed my mind about attending at the last moment. I decided I needed to see for myself what sort of woman could convince my brother to make such a spectacle of himself. There was no pretense of courtesy in Victoria's tone, no attempt to disguise her hostility. Eleanor found this oddly refreshing after the false pleasantries she had endured from the other guests. "I did not convince your brother of anything, Mrs. Ashford. The proposal was entirely his idea." "Oh, I'm quite certain it was." Victoria's eyes were the same penetrating grey as Alexander's, but where his gaze was cold and assessing, hers burned with barely suppressed anger. "Alexander has always enjoyed shocking people, flouting conventions that the rest of us must live by. But this, marrying a housemaid, this goes beyond his usual rebellions. Tell me, Miss Grey, or should I say Mrs. Thornfield, what exactly did you do to secure this remarkable promotion in your circumstances?" The implication was clear and deeply insulting. Eleanor felt colour rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice level. "I accepted a proposal of marriage, Mrs. Ashford. Nothing more, nothing less. How convenient for you, and how very inconvenient for the rest of us, who must now explain to our friends and associates why Alexander has taken leave of his senses." Victoria took a sip of champagne, her eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "Let me be direct with you, since I suspect you are not accustomed to the subtleties of polite society. This marriage is a farce, a joke, something Alexander is doing to amuse himself or prove some point that only he understands. You may enjoy playing the role of Mrs. Thornfield for a few weeks or months, but eventually my brother will tire of this game. And when he does, you will find yourself back where you started, albeit with a generous settlement to ease the sting of rejection. I hope you are prepared for that inevitability." Eleanor met Victoria's gaze steadily. There was truth in what she said. Eleanor was not naive enough to believe otherwise, but there was also cruelty, a desire to wound that went beyond mere concern for a brother's welfare. "I appreciate your candor, Mrs. Ashford, but I must point out that my arrangement with your brother is exactly that, an arrangement between us. Whatever the future holds, it is not your concern." For a moment, Victoria looked as if she might say something more, something cutting and final, but then her expression shifted, became almost thoughtful. "You know, you are not at all what I expected. I had imagined someone more simpering, more obviously mercenary, but you have a spine. I'll grant you that. Perhaps this will be more interesting than I anticipated." She raised her champagne glass in a mock toast. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Thornfield. I suspect you will need all the fortitude you possess to survive it." With that, Victoria drifted away, leaving Eleanor alone once more in the crowd of strangers. The encounter had shaken her more than she cared to admit. Not because of Victoria's hostility. Eleanor had faced hostility before and survived it, but because her words had given voice to doubts that Eleanor had been trying to suppress since accepting Alexander's proposal. What was she doing here, in this borrowed gown, wearing this ridiculous ring, pretending to be something she was not? What madness had possessed her to think she could navigate this world of wealth and privilege without being destroyed by it? She thought back to the moment when Alexander had proposed, to the shock and confusion that had flooded through her. Her first instinct had been to refuse, to laugh at the absurdity of the suggestion. She was a housemaid, educated beyond her station, perhaps. Her father had been a schoolmaster before his death and had instilled in her a love of learning that genteel poverty could not erase, but still firmly planted in the working class. Men like Alexander Thornfield did not marry women like her. It was not done. It was not even contemplated. And yet he had been entirely serious. She had seen it in his face, in the cold, businesslike manner in which he laid out the terms of his proposal. He did not want her love, did not even seem to want her companionship. He wanted a wife in name only, someone to fulfill some purpose she did not fully understand. And in exchange, he was offering her security such as she had never imagined possible. $10 million. The sum was beyond her comprehension, an amount that could support her for the rest of her life and perhaps support her hypothetical children and their children after them. She had said yes, not because she loved him, she barely knew him, but because she was tired. Tired of scrubbing floors and dusting shelves and bowing her head to people who treated her as if she were invisible. Tired of wearing second-hand clothes and calculating whether she could afford an extra candle to read by at night. Tired of being powerless in a world that ground down people like her without thought or remorse. Alexander's offer was cold and transactional, but it was also honest. He was not pretending to love her, was not making promises he had no intention of keeping. In its own way, that honesty had been more appealing than any romantic declaration could have been. But now, standing in this glittering ballroom surrounded by people who viewed her as an interloper and a curiosity, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The money would be welcome, certainly, if she survived long enough to claim it. But at what cost? What would this world do to her before it was finished? You look like you could use this. A hand appeared in her peripheral vision, holding a glass of champagne. Eleanor turned to find a man regarding her with sympathetic eyes. He was perhaps 30, with sandy hair and an open, friendly face that stood in stark contrast to the calculating expression she had encountered thus far. "I'm Marcus Whitmore, a friend of the groom, though I use the term loosely given what he's put himself through today." Eleanor accepted the champagne gratefully. Eleanor Thornfield, friend of no one apparently. Marcus laughed at that, a genuine sound of amusement that made several nearby guests turn to stare. "Well, that's honest anyway, though I wouldn't say no one. Alexander must have some regard for you, or he wouldn't have gone through with this circus." "I suspect his regard extends only as far as my usefulness in whatever game he's playing," Eleanor said, then immediately regretted her candor. She should not be speaking this way to Alexander's friends, should not be revealing her doubts and uncertainties to people who might use them against her. But Marcus only nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're probably right. Alexander does have a tendency to view people as pieces on a chessboard, useful for achieving particular ends. But I wouldn't underestimate yourself, Mrs. Thornfield. It takes considerable courage to walk into a situation like this with your eyes open. Most people would have run screaming in the opposite direction." "Perhaps I should have," Eleanor murmured, taking a sip of champagne. It was excellent, of course, smooth and perfectly chilled, and she wondered if she would ever become accustomed to such casual luxury. Perhaps, but you didn't. Marcus glanced across the ballroom to where Alexander stood in conversation with several stern-looking men in expensive suits. "Can I give you some unsolicited advice, Mrs. Thornfield? I suspect you will regardless of my answer." "Fair point. Here it is. Don't try to be what Alexander expects you to be. He chose you for reasons that probably don't make sense to anyone but him, and those reasons had nothing to do with who you actually are. If you try to mold yourself into whatever you think he wants, you'll lose yourself in the process. Be who you are. It's the only thing that might actually surprise him." Before Eleanor could respond, a bell chimed, signaling that dinner was to be served. The guests began moving toward the elaborately decorated tables, and Marcus offered her his arm with theatrical gallantry. "May I escort you to your seat, Mrs. Thornfield? I believe you're meant to sit at the head table, though I warn you that the conversation there tends toward the tedious." Eleanor accepted his arm, grateful for his kindness, even as she wondered at his motives. No one did anything without reason. She had learned that much in her years of service. What did Marcus Whitmore gain by befriending her? Was he Alexander's spy, tasked with reporting back on her behavior? Or was he genuinely kind, one of those rare souls who acted from compassion rather than calculation? The dinner itself was interminable. Course after course appeared before her, each more elaborate than the last, prepared with techniques and ingredients she could not begin to identify. She ate sparingly, conscious of the eyes upon her, afraid of committing some social error that would mark her irredeemably as an outsider. Alexander sat beside her, but did not speak to her. His attention focused on the man to his left, some banker or investor with whom he was discussing matters of high finance in terms she could not follow. Speeches were made, toasts were offered. Some were sincere, most were not, and all were accompanied by laughter that had the brittle quality of something forced. Alexander responded to each with the same cool courtesy, his expression never changing, his words perfectly calibrated to reveal nothing of his thoughts or feelings. Eleanor found herself studying him covertly, trying to understand the man she had married. He was handsome, certainly, but it was a cold beauty, like that of a marble statue. There was no warmth in him, no softness, nothing that invited intimacy or affection. He was remote, untouchable, locked away behind walls that seemed impenetrable. Why had he truly proposed to her? Victoria's words echoed in her mind. Alexander has always enjoyed shocking people, flouting conventions. Was that all this was? An elaborate joke, a way of thumbing his nose at society's expectations? Or was there something more, some darker purpose she had not yet divined? The dinner finally concluded, and music began to play, a full orchestra, because apparently a string quartet was insufficient for Alexander Thornfield's wedding reception. Couples began to move onto the dance floor, and Eleanor felt a surge of panic. She could not dance, not in the way these people danced. She had learned the basics as a girl, before her father's death and the genteel poverty that followed, but she had no practice, no confidence, no ability to move gracefully in this heavy gown and these impractical shoes. Alexander stood and offered her his hand, his expression as unreadable as ever. "We are expected to dance, Mrs. Thornfield. I trust you can manage a waltz?" "I will do my best not to cripple you, Mr. Thornfield," she replied, taking his hand because refusal was not an option. He led her onto the dance floor, and the other couples stepped back to give them space, all eyes upon the newlyweds. The music swelled, and Alexander placed one hand on her waist, holding her other hand in his. Eleanor felt the warmth of his touch, even through the fabric of her gown, felt the strength in his fingers as he began to lead her through the steps of the waltz. She had expected him to be impatient with her inevitable mistakes, but he was not. When she stumbled, he steadied her with practiced ease. When she lost count of the rhythm, he guided her back without comment. He was, she realized, an excellent dancer, moving with the same controlled grace he brought to all his actions. And despite herself, despite everything, she found herself relaxing slightly in his arms, allowing him to lead her through the patterns of the dance. "You are surprising me, Mrs. Thornfield," he said quietly, his voice meant only for her ears. "I had expected you to be more overwhelmed by all this. Would you have preferred me to swoon or weep?" she asked, matching his quiet tone. "I am not the swooning type, Mr. Thornfield, and I see no benefit in tears." "No, I suppose you are not." He studied her face as they turned across the floor, his expression thoughtful. "You are not what I expected either. When I proposed to you, I had assumed you would be grateful, obsequious even, but you have neither thanked me nor fawned upon me. Why is that?" Eleanor met his gaze directly. "Because you did not marry me out of kindness, Mr. Thornfield, and we both know it. You married me to serve some purpose of your own, a purpose you have not deigned to explain. I am grateful for the security your offer provides, but I will not pretend that this arrangement is anything other than what it is, a business transaction." For a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or even respect. But then it was gone, replaced by his usual cool indifference. "You are quite right, of course. It is a business transaction. I am pleased that you understand that. It will make things simpler." "Will it?" Eleanor asked, and she was not entirely certain what she was asking. The dance ended, and Alexander released her with what might have been relief. Other couples claimed the floor, and he escorted her back to their table, his hand on her elbow, with the impersonal touch of a man guiding a stranger through a crowd. The evening wore on. More champagne was consumed, more toasts were made, and Eleanor endured it all with the stoic patience she had learned in her years of service. She smiled when it seemed appropriate, nodded at conversations she did not fully understand, and counted the minutes until this ordeal would be over. Finally, mercifully, the reception began to wind down. Guests started to depart, offering final congratulations and well wishes that rang hollow in Eleanor's ears. Alexander stood beside her as they bid farewell to each departing couple, his hand resting on the small of her back in a gesture that suggested intimacy while conveying nothing of the sort. She could feel the heat of his palm through the silk of her gown, could feel the slight pressure as he guided her through the motions expected of them. When the last guest had departed, when the musicians had packed their instruments, and the staff had begun the monumental task of clearing away the detritus of the celebration, Alexander turned to her. His expression was unreadable in the dim light of the ballroom, but there was something in his posture, some tension that had not been present before. "It is time," he said simply. Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. She knew what came next, knew what was expected on a wedding night, and the knowledge filled her with a combination of dread and strange anticipation. She had made her choice when she accepted his proposal. She had known what marriage entailed, and yet now, facing the reality of it, she found herself uncertain, even afraid. They walked through the silent corridors of Thornfield Manor, their footsteps echoing on marble floors. Servants melted away at their approach, vanishing into doorways and side passages with the practiced invisibility of those who served the wealthy. Eleanor was acutely conscious of Alexander beside her, of his height and his proximity, of the reality that this man was now her husband-in-law, if not yet, in fact. They reached a door, his door, she realized, the entrance to his private chambers. He opened it and gestured for her to enter first, a courtesy that somehow made her more nervous rather than less. The room beyond was vast and decorated in shades of deep blue and grey, masculine and austere, with none of the excessive ornamentation that characterized the rest of the manor. A fire burned in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. And dominating the space, impossible to ignore, was an enormous bed draped in silk and velvet. Eleanor stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped before her, waiting. Alexander closed the door behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo like thunder in the quiet space. He moved to a cabinet and poured himself a measure of whiskey, not offering her any, drinking it in one swallow before setting the glass down with controlled precision. Then he turned to face her, and Eleanor saw something in his expression that she had not seen before. Not desire exactly, but something complex and difficult to read. Resignation, perhaps, or determination, or some emotion she did not have the experience to identify. "There is something I need to tell you," he said, his voice quiet in the firelit room. "Something you have a right to know before we proceed any further with this arrangement." Eleanor waited, her heart pounding, uncertain what revelation could possibly make this strange situation stranger still. Alexander moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, could smell the whiskey on his breath, and some expensive cologne that did not quite mask the scent of the man beneath. He looked at her for a long moment, his grey eyes searching her face as if seeking something he expected not to find. "I did not marry you on a whim, Eleanor," he said, using her given name for the first time. "I married you because I needed a wife, and you were the most suitable candidate for my purposes. But the reasons I needed a wife, the real reasons, are not what you might imagine." "Then what are they?" Eleanor asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Alexander hesitated, and in that hesitation, Eleanor saw something that shocked her: vulnerability. It was there only for an instant before his usual mask of indifference settled back into place, but she had seen it, and the glimpse of the man behind the walls made her pulse quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "I am dying," he said flatly, as if announcing a minor inconvenience rather than a death sentence. "I have perhaps a year, possibly less. The doctors have tried everything, but there is no cure, no treatment, no hope of recovery." and I will be damned if I die without ensuring that my fortune goes to someone of my own choosing, rather than being carved up by relatives I despise and opportunists I have never met." The words hung in the air between them, stark and terrible in their finality. Eleanor stared at Alexander, trying to comprehend what he had just told her, trying to reconcile this revelation with the man who stood before her, looking as vital and healthy as any person she had ever seen. Dying. He was dying. The words seemed impossible, absurd, and yet she saw the truth of it in his eyes, in the way he held himself, as if bracing for her reaction. "I don't understand," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "You look perfectly well. You danced tonight, you spoke with guests, you showed no sign of illness. The disease is not visible, not yet. In time it will be, but for now I retain the appearance of health even as my body betrays me from within." Alexander moved away from her toward the window that overlooked the grounds, his back to her as he spoke. "I was diagnosed 6 months ago. I consulted the best physicians in the world, sought second opinions and third opinions and opinions from specialists whose names you would recognize. The verdict was always the same. There is no cure. There is only time, and not much of it." Eleanor sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The revelation had struck her like a physical blow, and she found herself struggling to order her thoughts. "Why did you not tell me this before? Why allow me to marry you without knowing? Would you have accepted if you had known?" Alexander turned to face her, and there was something almost like amusement in his expression. "Would you have willingly bound yourself to a dying man, knowing that your status as a widow would come quickly, and with it all the complications that entails?" "I don't know," Eleanor said honestly, "but I deserved the chance to make that choice with full knowledge of what it meant. Perhaps, but I could not risk refusal. I needed a wife, and I needed one quickly before the illness progresses to a stage where I am no longer capable of managing my affairs." He moved back toward her, standing before the fireplace, with his hands clasped behind his back, looking every inch the businessman delivering an unfortunate quarterly report. "You asked me once why I chose you, why I would marry someone so obviously unsuited to my station. The answer is simple: because you had nothing to gain by refusing me and everything to gain by accepting. Because you would be grateful for the opportunity I offered, and gratitude, I reasoned, would make you compliant. Because you were plain enough that no one would suspect I married you for love or lust, which would give credence to other explanations for this union." "What other explanations?" Eleanor asked, though she was beginning to understand. "That I married you out of eccentricity, out of a desire to shock society, out of some whim that made sense only to me." Alexander's smile was bitter. "Let them think what they like. Let them gossip and speculate and invent whatever stories suit their fancy. The truth, that I married to ensure my fortune passes to you rather than to my grasping relatives, will remain between us." Eleanor rose from her chair, her mind working through the implications of what he had revealed. "You married me to make me your heir, to ensure that when you die, I inherit everything. Precisely, with one caveat: you must remain married to me until my death. If you divorce me, or if the marriage is annulled, you receive nothing beyond the settlement specified in the prenuptial agreement. But if you remain my wife, if you endure whatever months remain to me, then everything I possess becomes yours. The fortune, the properties, the investments, all of it." He paused, studying her reaction. "It is, I believe, a generous arrangement. Certainly more generous than cleaning houses for the rest of your life." There was something almost cruel in his tone, a challenge, as if he expected her to be overwhelmed by greed or appalled by the coldness of his calculation. But Eleanor felt neither of those things. Instead, she felt a strange mixture of pity and anger, and something else she could not quite identify. "You have planned all of this," she said slowly. "The proposal, the hasty wedding, even the dare with your friends. It was all designed to create a plausible explanation for why Alexander Thornfield would marry someone like me. The dare was Marcus's idea, actually, though I seized upon it quickly enough once it was made. It provided exactly the cover I needed. Alexander poured himself another whiskey, and this time he poured one for her as well, bringing the glass to where she stood. "You may as well drink. This conversation is far from over." Eleanor accepted the glass, but did not drink immediately. She looked at the amber liquid, watching the way it caught the firelight, trying to sort through the tangle of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Why me specifically? There must have been other women who would have served your purposes, women with more grace, more education, more ability to navigate the world you inhabit. There were, Alexander admitted, but those women would have had questions. They would have wanted to know why I was in such haste, why I would choose them over more suitable candidates. They would have suspected something was wrong, and suspicion leads to investigation, and investigation could have exposed my illness before I was ready for it to become public knowledge. He took a sip of his whiskey, his expression thoughtful. You, on the other hand, were in no position to ask questions. You needed what I was offering too desperately to look too closely at the gift horse's mouth. It was true, and Eleanor could not deny it. She had been so focused on the security he offered, so dazzled by the prospect of escaping her circumstances, that she had not questioned his motives as deeply as she should have. She had known the proposal was strange, had known there must be some reason beyond what he stated, but she had chosen not to probe too deeply, afraid that examination might cause the opportunity to evaporate. "And now?" she asked. "Now that I know the truth, what happens? Now you make a choice." Alexander set his glass down and moved closer to her, so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the fine grain of his skin and the way his pulse beat at his throat. "You can leave. I will have the marriage annulled, will pay you a generous settlement for your trouble, and you can return to your former life or make a new one elsewhere with the money I provide. Or you can stay. You can remain my wife, endure whatever time remains to me, and inherit everything when I am gone. But understand this, if you stay, I will expect you to fulfill all the duties of a wife. I will not have a marriage in name only. I have too little time left to waste it on pretense." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She understood what he was telling her, what he was asking. He wanted a real marriage, at least in the physical sense, for whatever months remained to him. The thought should have repulsed her. He was essentially proposing that she exchange her body for his fortune, and yet she found she was not repulsed. She was frightened, certainly, and uncertain, but not repulsed. She looked at him, really looked at him, studying the man who had so unexpectedly altered the course of her life. He was handsome in his cold, aristocratic way, but it was more than that. There was something in his eyes now, something raw and unguarded, that called to something in her she had not known existed. He was dying, and he knew it, and that knowledge had stripped away some of his pretense, revealed the vulnerable man beneath the armor of wealth and indifference. "If I stay," she said carefully, "I want honesty between us, no more deceptions, no more secrets. I will not live whatever time remains as your fool, kept ignorant of matters that concern me directly." "Agreed," Alexander said, and she heard the relief in his voice, though he tried to hide it. "And I will not be treated as merely a convenience, a vessel for your heirs or a nurse for your decline. If I am to be your wife, truly your wife, then you will accord me the respect that position demands." That was always my intention. He reached out and took the whiskey glass from her hand, setting it aside with his own. "I am many things, Eleanor, most of them not particularly admirable. But I am not a hypocrite. If I demand honesty from you, I will give it in return. If I expect you to fulfill the duties of a wife, I will fulfill the duties of a husband." "What duties?" Eleanor asked, and was surprised to hear a slight tremor in her voice. "What exactly do you expect of me? For tonight? Very little." Alexander lifted his hand and touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with unexpected gentleness. You are frightened, and that is understandable. I have given you a great deal of information to absorb, and I will not compound your distress by making demands you are not ready to meet. Tonight, we will sleep. Tomorrow, and in the days that follow, we will learn to be husband and wife in truth." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, though she could not have said whether they were tears of relief or disappointment or some more complex emotion. She blinked them away, refusing to show weakness before this man who had already seen too much of her vulnerability. "You are not what I expected," she said softly. "Nor are you." Alexander's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, a caress so light she might have imagined it. "I chose you because I thought you would be malleable, grateful, easy to control. But I was wrong. You have a strength in you, Eleanor, a resilience that I did not anticipate. It is refreshing." He stepped back then, breaking the moment of intimacy, and moved toward a door she had not noticed before. "That leads to a dressing room and another bedroom beyond it. You may sleep there tonight if you prefer. Mrs. Hendricks has had your belongings moved there, along with a new wardrobe more suited to your new station. I will make no demands on you until you are ready to accept them." With that, he turned away from her, dismissing her as effectively as if she had been a servant. Eleanor stood for a moment, uncertain whether she should leave or stay, uncertain what she wanted. Then, making a decision that surprised even herself, she moved toward the door he had indicated. The dressing room was nearly as large as the bedroom she had shared with 3 other maids in the servants' quarters. It was lined with wardrobes and mirrors, and a vanity table sat in one corner, its surface covered with bottles and jars of cosmetics she did not know how to use. Beyond was indeed another bedroom, smaller than Alexander's, but still luxurious beyond anything she had experienced. The bed was turned down, and a nightgown had been laid out for her, white silk that looked like it had never been worn. Eleanor stood in the center of this room, looking around at the evidence of her transformed circumstances, and felt the first stirrings of something that might have been hope. Alexander was dying, yes, and that was a tragedy. But he had chosen her, had trusted her with his secret, had offered her not just wealth, but honesty. And in that honesty, she had glimpsed a man who was more than the cold, calculating figure he presented to the world. She changed into the nightgown, the silk cool and strange against her skin. She had never worn anything so fine, had never felt fabric that moved like water and clung to her body in ways that were both modest and suggestive. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman who stared back. Was this her? This person in silk and lace, with a diamond ring on her finger and a dying millionaire in the next room? She should have gone to bed then, should have climbed between those fine sheets and tried to sleep. But instead, she found herself walking back through the dressing room, back toward the door that led to Alexander's bedroom. She stood there for a long moment, her hand on the doorknob, trying to understand what she was doing, what she wanted. Then she opened the door. Alexander stood by the window, looking out over the grounds. He had removed his jacket and tie, and his shirt was partially unbuttoned, revealing the strong column of his throat and the beginning of his chest. He turned when he heard the door open, surprise flickering across his face before he could mask it. "I thought you had retired," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I had," Eleanor replied. "But then I realized something. You said you would not make demands I was not ready to meet. But you did not ask if I was ready. You simply assumed I would need time." Alexander's eyes widened slightly, and she saw understanding dawn in them, followed by something that might have been desire. "Are you saying you are ready?" Eleanor crossed the room toward him, her bare feet silent on the thick carpet. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but she kept her voice steady. "I am saying that I have made my choice. I will stay. I will be your wife in all ways. And I see no reason to delay what is inevitable." She reached him and stood before him, tilting her head back to meet his gaze. She was not a tall woman, and even without his shoes he towered over her. But she did not feel small. She felt for the first time in her life powerful. She had made a choice, had taken control of her destiny, and in doing so had somehow inverted the dynamic between them. He had needed her enough to reveal his weakness, and in that revelation had given her a weapon she could use against him if she chose. But she did not want to use it. She wanted something else entirely, something she had not known she was capable of wanting. Alexander studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he reached out and drew her to him, his arms encircling her with a gentleness that contradicted his earlier coldness. She felt the solid warmth of his body through the thin silk of her nightgown, felt the steady beat of his heart against her cheek as he held her close. "You are extraordinary," he murmured into her hair. "I had not expected this. I had not expected you." Eleanor tilted her face up toward his, and he kissed her, not with the perfunctory brush of lips they had shared at the altar, but with real passion, real heat. His mouth moved over hers with a hunger that startled her, and she found herself responding, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing closer to his. She had never been kissed like this, had never known that a kiss could set fire to her blood and make her forget everything except the man who held her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander looked at her with something like wonder in his eyes. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough. "Once this happens, there is no going back. You will be my wife in truth, and I will not let you go easily." "I am certain," Eleanor said, and she was. Whatever the future held, whatever pain or loss awaited them, she knew this was right. This was where she was meant to be, at least for now. Alexander swept her into his arms then, carrying her to the bed with an ease that spoke of strength still intact despite his illness. He laid her down on the silk coverlet and stood looking at her for a moment, his eyes traveling over her body in a way that made her feel both exposed and desired. Then he joined her, his weight settling beside her, his hands beginning to explore the curves hidden beneath her nightgown. Eleanor had not known what to expect from this night, had not allowed herself to imagine what intimacy with Alexander might be like. She had assumed it would be brief and businesslike, a transaction no different from their marriage itself, but it was not like that at all. Alexander touched her as if she were precious, as if she were something to be savored rather than simply possessed. His hands and mouth moved over her skin with a reverence that made her breath catch, and when he finally removed her nightgown and his own remaining clothes, she felt no shame, only a fierce rightness. Their coupling was not gentle, could not be gentle given the passion that had ignited between them, but neither was it brutal or thoughtless. Alexander seemed to know instinctively what pleased her, seemed to read her body's responses with the same acuity he brought to reading balance sheets and market trends. And Eleanor, for her part, discovered capacities in herself she had not known existed, discovered that her body could feel things she had only read about in books, discovered that pleasure could be so intense it bordered on pain. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the ruined bed, both breathing hard, both slick with sweat despite the coolness of the room. Alexander held her close, his arms wrapped around her as if afraid she might disappear, and Eleanor rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat gradually slow to its normal rhythm. "Thank you," he said quietly, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that made her throat tight with emotion. "For what?" Eleanor asked. "For staying, for choosing this, for giving me something real in the time I have left." His hand stroked her hair with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything she knew of him. "I have lived my entire life behind walls, Eleanor. I have allowed no one close, trusted no one, felt nothing beyond the satisfaction of a successful business venture. But tonight, with you, I felt something more. Something I did not know I was capable of feeling." Eleanor lifted her head to look at him, and in the dim firelight she saw tears glistening in his eyes, though he blinked them away before they could fall. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw, the sharp blade of his cheekbone. "I felt it too," she whispered. "I did not expect to. I thought this would be merely an arrangement, a means to an end, but it is more than that." You are more than that." Alexander captured her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her palm with such tenderness that she felt tears spring to her own eyes. "We are both more than we believed ourselves to be," he said. "Perhaps that is what death does. Strips away the pretense and leaves only the truth beneath." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, two people who had come together for the most calculated of reasons and had found, against all odds, something approaching grace. Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through windows she had not thought to close the night before. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure of where she was, or why the bed beneath her felt so impossibly soft. Then memory returned in a rush. The wedding, the revelation, the night that had followed. And she turned her head to find Alexander still beside her, his face relaxed in sleep in a way it never was when he was awake. She studied him in the morning light, this man who was now her husband in every sense of the word. In sleep he looked younger, less guarded, the harsh lines of his face softened into something almost vulnerable. She could see now the shadows beneath his eyes that she had not noticed before, the slight hollowness to his cheeks that spoke of weight lost and strength ebbing. The signs of his illness were subtle, barely perceptible, but now that she knew to look for them, she could not unsee them. Her heart contracted with an emotion she was not ready to name. Pity, perhaps, sorrow for a life that would be cut short before its time. But there was something more, something deeper and more dangerous. She had not expected to feel anything for Alexander Thornfield, beyond gratitude for the security he offered, and perhaps a distant respect for his intelligence and capability. She had certainly not expected to feel this aching tenderness, this desire to protect him from a fate that could not be escaped. Alexander's eyes opened, and for a moment he looked at her with such naked longing that she felt her breath catch. Then his usual mask of control settled back into place, though not as completely as it had before. Something had shifted between them in the night. Some barrier had been breached, and they both knew it. "Good morning, Mrs. Thornfield," he said, his voice rough with sleep and something else. "I trust you slept well." "Better than I have in years," Eleanor replied honestly. "And you?" "The same." He reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek with a tenderness that seemed habitual now, rather than calculated. "I should tell you that I have appointments today, meetings that cannot be postponed. But tonight, we will dine together, just the two of us. I find I am not ready to share you with the world just yet." Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I would like that." They rose eventually, and Eleanor returned to her own room to dress with the assistance of a lady's maid, who had materialized as if summoned by magic. The girl, she could not have been more than 20, introduced herself as Mary and proceeded to help Eleanor navigate the complexities of her new wardrobe with a patience that suggested she had been well briefed on the unusual circumstances of the new Mrs. Thornfield's background. The dress Mary selected was a deep emerald green that brought out the color of Eleanor's eyes, cut in the latest fashion, but not so elaborate as to be impractical. Mary did something clever with Eleanor's hair, pinning it in a style that was both elegant and unfussy, and when Eleanor finally looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman who stared back. She looked, she thought with some surprise, almost beautiful, or if not beautiful, then at least striking, interesting, someone worth a second glance. She descended to breakfast to find that Alexander had already left for his meetings, but he had left her a note, written in a bold, slashing hand that she was learning to recognize as uniquely his. "Take today to familiarize yourself with your new home. Mrs. Hendricks will answer any questions you might have. The library is particularly well stocked. I think you will find much there to interest you. A." Eleanor smiled at the note, touched by his thoughtfulness, even as she recognized the control implicit in his instructions. He had created a world for her, complete in every detail, and expected her to inhabit it according to his design. But there was kindness in that control too, an understanding of what she might need to feel comfortable in her new circumstances. Mrs. Hendricks proved to be a revelation. The woman who had been Eleanor's supervisor mere days ago now treated her with perfect deference, as if the transformation from housemaid to mistress had erased all memory of their previous relationship. She gave Eleanor a tour of the manor, pointing out rooms and features that Eleanor had never been permitted to see during her time in service, and answered Eleanor's questions with a patience that suggested she had been expecting them. "The master has instructed that you are to have free run of the house, Mrs. Thornfield," Mrs. Hendricks said, as they walked through a portrait gallery lined with the stern faces of Alexander's ancestors. "You may go anywhere you wish, use any of the facilities, and the staff has been instructed to fulfill any request you might make. If there is anything you need, you have only to ask." "Thank you, Mrs. Hendricks," Eleanor said, and meant it. "I confess I feel somewhat overwhelmed by all of this. Yesterday I was cleaning these very floors, and today I am meant to be their mistress. The transition is rather abrupt." Mrs. Hendricks's expression softened slightly, though she maintained her professional demeanor. "If I may speak freely, Mrs. Thornfield, I have served this household for 30 years. I have seen Mr. Alexander grow from a boy to a man, and I have never known him to act without purpose. Whatever his reasons for marrying you, I am certain they are sound. And I can tell you this, I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you this morning when he left for his meetings. There was something in his face, a lightness perhaps, or a peace, that I have not seen in all the years I have known him." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at these words, and she found herself both pleased and embarrassed by the observation. "You are very kind to say so. I speak only the truth, Mrs. Thornfield. Now, shall I show you the library? The master was quite insistent that you would wish to see it." The library was magnificent, a 2-story room lined floor to ceiling with books, with a balcony running around the upper level and comfortable chairs scattered throughout for reading. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as she looked around at the wealth of knowledge contained in this single room. She had always loved books, had always hungered for learning, but her circumstances had limited her access to perhaps a handful of volumes at a time, borrowed from lending libraries, or purchased second-hand when she could afford it. To have all of this at her disposal, to be able to read whatever she wished, whenever she wished, seemed almost too wonderful to be real. She spent the rest of the morning exploring the library, pulling down volumes at random and reading passages that caught her eye. She found first editions of novels she had only read in cheap reprints, leather-bound collections of poetry that made her heart sing, treatises on philosophy and science and history that opened up worlds she had barely known existed. She lost herself completely in the books, and when a maid came to fetch her for lunch, she was startled to discover that hours had passed without her notice. The afternoon she spent exploring the grounds, walking through gardens that were still beautiful even in the lateness of the season. The air was crisp and cold, and she wrapped herself in a coat that Mary had provided, marveling at the softness of the cashmere and the warmth it provided. She walked past fountains and statuary, through a rose garden where the last blooms clung stubbornly to life, and finally to a small folly at the edge of the property that offered a view of the surrounding countryside. Standing there, looking out over land that now belonged to her husband, and would, if all went according to his plan, someday belong to her, Eleanor felt a complex mixture of emotions. Gratitude, certainly, for the security and opportunity Alexander had provided, but also guilt, for she could not shake the feeling that she was profiting from his death, that her good fortune was built on his tragedy. And beneath both of those emotions was something else, something she was even more reluctant to acknowledge, a growing affection for the man who had so unexpectedly become her husband. She returned to the manor as the sun was setting, and Mary helped her change into an evening gown for dinner. This dress was simpler than her wedding gown, but no less elegant, a deep sapphire blue that made her skin glow in the candlelight. Mary worked some magic with Eleanor's hair again and applied a subtle touch of cosmetics that enhanced rather than masked her features. When Eleanor looked in the mirror this time, she saw a woman who belonged in Alexander's world, who could stand beside him without shame or embarrassment. Dinner was served in a small dining room that Eleanor had not seen during her morning tour, an intimate space with a table just large enough for two and a fire crackling in the hearth. Alexander was already there when she arrived, standing by the window with a glass of wine in his hand, and when he turned to look at her, she saw his breath catch. "You are beautiful," he said simply, and there was such sincerity in his voice that Eleanor felt tears threaten again. "I had not fully appreciated it before, but you are truly beautiful, Eleanor." "You are kind to say so," Eleanor replied, moving to join him by the window. "Though I think it is the dress and Mary's skilled hands more than any natural quality of mine." "No," Alexander said firmly. "The dress and the cosmetics merely reveal what was always there. I was a fool not to see it from the beginning." He set down his wineglass and took both of her hands in his, looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "I have been thinking today, during my meetings and between them, about last night, about what happened between us." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "As have I. I want you to understand something," Alexander continued, his grip on her hands tightening slightly. "When I proposed this arrangement, I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought I could maintain the emotional distance necessary to make this a purely practical matter, but I was wrong. What happened between us last night was not practical, Eleanor. It was not distant. It was real and intense, and it has complicated everything in ways I did not anticipate." "Complicated how?" Eleanor asked, though she thought she knew. "Because I find I care for you," Alexander said, and the words seemed to cost him something to speak. "I did not want to care. I did not plan to care, but I do. And that caring makes the inevitability of my death not merely a fact to be managed, but a source of genuine grief. I will leave you, Eleanor, and far too soon, and the knowledge of that tears at me in ways I did not know I could be torn." Eleanor felt tears spill over then, running down her cheeks unchecked. "I care for you too," she whispered. "I did not expect to. I thought I could remain unmoved, could accept your proposition, and keep my heart safe. But I cannot. You have become real to me, Alexander. You have become precious, and the thought of losing you is unbearable." Alexander pulled her into his arms then, holding her close as she wept against his chest. "I am sorry," he murmured into her hair. "I am sorry for drawing you into this, for making you care, when caring will only bring you pain. I should have chosen someone else, someone less capable of touching my heart." "No," Eleanor said fiercely, pulling back to look at him. "Do not apologize for this. Do not apologize for making me feel things I never thought I would feel. Whatever pain comes later, it will be worth it for the joy of knowing you now, of having this time with you." They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the firelight, two people who had come together by design and stayed by choice. Then Alexander kissed her, slowly and thoroughly, and Eleanor kissed him back with all the passion and tenderness she had discovered herself capable of feeling. Dinner, when they finally sat down to it, was a quiet affair. They spoke of inconsequential things: the books Eleanor had discovered in the library, the meetings Alexander had attended, the garden and its fading beauty. But beneath the ordinary conversation ran a current of deeper feeling, a connection that had been forged in honesty and strengthened by their mutual acknowledgement of its existence. After dinner, Alexander surprised her by leading her not back to his bedroom, but to a music room she had not yet seen. A grand piano stood in one corner, and he sat down at it with the ease of long practice, running his fingers over the keys in a way that suggested genuine skill. "I did not know you played," Eleanor said, settling into a chair near the piano. "There is much you do not know about me yet," Alexander replied with a slight smile. "I learned as a child, at my mother's insistence. She believed that a gentleman should be accomplished in the arts as well as in business. I hated it at the time, resented the hours spent practicing when I would rather have been doing anything else. But I am grateful for it now. Music has been one of the few things that brings me peace." He began to play then, and Eleanor listened in wonder as the notes filled the room. He played Chopin, Debussy, pieces that were at once melancholy and beautiful, that spoke of longing and loss and brief moments of transcendent joy. His hands moved over the keys with sureness and grace, and Eleanor found herself thinking that this was another facet of the man she had married, another layer of complexity she had not expected. When he finally stopped playing, the silence seemed loud in comparison. Eleanor rose and moved to stand beside the piano, looking down at him. "That was extraordinary." "It was adequate," Alexander said with characteristic self-deprecation. "I am out of practice. There was a time when I played daily, but in recent years I have neglected it in favor of business concerns that now seem far less important than they once did." "Will you play for me again?" Eleanor asked. "I would like to hear more." "I will play for you every night if you wish it," Alexander said, standing and drawing her close. "I will do anything that brings you pleasure, Eleanor. I have so little time to give you. I would make what time remains as rich and full as possible." They returned to his bedroom that night, and what passed between them was both passionate and tender, a physical expression of the emotional connection that had grown between them so quickly and so unexpectedly. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Eleanor's head resting on his chest, Alexander spoke quietly of his childhood, of a mother who had been cold and distant, of a father who had been too busy building an empire to notice his son's loneliness. He spoke of boarding schools and tutors, of wealth that had isolated rather than connected him, of learning early that people valued him for his money rather than for himself. Eleanor listened, saying little, understanding now the walls he had built around himself and why her unexpected genuineness had breached them. She told him in turn of her own childhood, of a father who had loved learning and had passed that love to his daughter, of the genteel poverty that had followed his death, of the years spent in service and the loneliness that had accompanied them. They were, she realized, both lonely souls who had found each other by accident and recognized in one another a kindred spirit. The days that followed established a pattern that became the rhythm of their life together. Alexander would leave early for business meetings, though he never stayed away longer than necessary. Eleanor would spend her mornings in the library, reading voraciously, educating herself in all the subjects she had never had the opportunity to study. In the afternoons, she would walk the grounds or explore the manor, slowly making it her own rather than merely a place where she was a guest. And in the evenings, she and Alexander would dine together, talk for hours about everything and nothing, and retire to bed where their physical intimacy deepened the emotional connection that was growing stronger with each passing day. It was, in many ways, an idyllic existence, marred only by the knowledge that it could not last. Alexander's illness remained largely invisible during those early weeks of their marriage, but Eleanor noticed small things, the way he would sometimes grip the edge of a table as if needing support, the occasional wince of pain he tried to hide, the nights when he would wake from sleep gasping for breath before regaining his composure. She did not speak of these observations, did not want to darken their time together with constant reminders of what was coming. But she noticed, and she grieved. 3 weeks into their marriage, Alexander came home early from his meetings, his face pale and his movements careful, in a way that suggested he was in pain. Eleanor was in the library when he found her, and she rose immediately at the sight of him, crossing to take his arm. "What has happened?" she asked, guiding him to a chair. "Nothing," Alexander said, but his voice was strained. "Merely a bad day. They come more frequently now." Eleanor knelt beside his chair, taking his hand in both of hers. "Tell me truly, Alexander, how much time do we have?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the struggle in his face between his instinct to protect her and his promise of honesty. Honesty won. "Months," he said quietly. "Perhaps less. The progression is faster than the doctors anticipated." My body is failing more quickly than their models predicted. Eleanor felt as if she had been struck, though she had known this moment would come. Knowing it intellectually and hearing it stated so boldly were two very different things. What can be done? There must be treatments, experimental procedures, something that could slow the progression or give you more time. There is nothing, Alexander said, with the finality of someone who had already exhausted every possibility. I have consulted the best minds in medicine, Eleanor. I've offered them unlimited funds to find a solution. There is none. This disease will kill me, and there is nothing anyone can do to prevent it. Eleanor pressed his hand to her cheek, feeling tears slip down her face, though she tried to hold them back. It is not fair. We have only just found each other. We have only just begun to live. I know, Alexander said, and his voice broke on the words. I know, my love. If I could change it, if I could give us more time, I would sacrifice everything I possess to do so. But I cannot. All I can do is love you as completely as I am able for whatever time remains to us. It was the first time he had spoken the word love aloud, though it had been implicit in everything between them for days. Hearing it now, in this moment of grief and acceptance, made Eleanor's heart both soar and shatter. I love you too, she whispered. I love you so much it terrifies me. They held each other then, there in the library surrounded by books and learning and all the accumulated wisdom of centuries that could not save them from this one simple, terrible truth, that love, however profound, could not stop death from claiming what it would.